I'm Tony Williams, and this is Brooklyn Savvy. Hi, I'm Tony Williams, and this is Brooklyn Savvy. Divorce in New York State once hard to get, so what's changed that makes it easier for unhappy couples to call it quits? We'll be analyzing this question and more with Roseann Branda. Now, you're with Caruso and Branda.
Yes, I am.
And it's right here in Brooklyn.
Yes, in the Dyker Heights area.
Excellent. Thanks so much for joining us. Now, let me introduce our Savvy panel. We've got Devorah Halberstam, Denise Arbisu, Ellen Salpeter, and Tracy Smith. Hey, ladies. Okay, so let's get started on this whole issue around New York State. Now, we have one of the lowest divorce rates in the country. What's driving that, and is it still now the case?
Well, it's, to me, a staggering statistic because the courts are so busy. Mm-hmm. But here in New York, people tend to get married a little bit later on in life.
Oh, really?
And that changes the statistic a little bit.
Is that New York City or New York State?
No, New York State. All through New York State, people tend, well, New York City has the highest divorce rate within the state, of course. However,
given real estate.
yeah. Interestingly, Long Island has the lowest, I believe, Nassau and Suffolk counties. Mm-hmm. But I think one of the reasons are that people get married a little bit later because the divorce rates for people that get married in their 20s are higher. Mm-hmm. I also think that up and until October of 2010,
right? Yeah.
The divorce laws made it difficult to get divorced.
Really? So what made it difficult to get the divorce?
Well, you needed to prove either adultery, cruel and inhuman treatment, that your spouse had been in prison for more than 3 years.
Oh, that can get you off the hook, ladies?
What a way to do it.
Whatever it takes.
That your spouse had abandoned you either by leaving for more than a year or by not agreeing to sexual relations for more than a year.
Right, because there's like a year of alienation of affection.
Well, it was called constructive abandonment.
Oh, okay. Alrighty. Okay.
I don't think abandonment is ever constructive.
True. And the last ground for divorce pre-October 2010 was living separate and apart, pursuant to either a separation agreement or a separation decree.
Okay.
So if you can believe it, the burden of proof for those 5 grounds for divorce was high.
Right.
And there was not a ground for divorce where people just no longer got along with each other.
So that's like the irreconcilable differences?
Well, the new ground for divorce that came into effect is called an irretrievable breakdown of a relationship.
Wow, that's
a mouthful. That sounds final. Probably the only legitimate
Irretrievable.
Excuse me.
Well, now all one has to do is make a sworn statement that their relationship has had an irretrievable breakdown for the 6 months preceding starting the
It's
divorce.
not very long.
It's not.
I mean, I think that's when you don't, after 6 months, you don't have to return the wedding gifts, right? They're kind of aligned, right?
That's a good point.
So does this make it, we're really giddy today, does this make, this whole idea of a no-fault divorce, is this part of why it's now called a no-fault divorce here in New York State?
Yes, it is.
Okay, so the fact that you can get divorced on those particular grounds.
Well, the reason why it was so many reasons why no fault had been brewing in New York for years and years and years, and we were one of the last states to
Are we the last state?
Yes.
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 Right.
Yes.
The last
We were.
Yes,
We were.
and what people had to do if they wanted to get a divorce and they did not want to air all of their dirty laundry was commit perjury. Because what would normally happen in the field, we would call it the legal fiction. One party would say that their partner refused to have sex with them for 1 year, and the people that wanted to process an uncontested divorce would process it under the grounds of what we called constructive abandonment.
But I always thought that both parties had to agree to a divorce. I mean, has this
not
changed?
true.
So,
Really? No,
so
no.
what would you do? You would withhold? I mean, I've heard from various friends situations where the husband refused to pay them, or the husband didn't pay, as a shaking them down to signing, the divorce papers, or to go ahead and start the proceedings.
Well,
my
that's
husband refused to pay my mortgage, for example.
Well, that's the reason why somebody would start a divorce proceeding, to get into the Supreme Court and get financial issues taken care of. But what's interesting about what you said is that there was a long period of time where everybody believed that it was women who, well, it's true, the women fought the no-fault divorce because they believed if the men had an easy avenue out, that they would suffer on a financial basis. But interestingly enough, from my own personal experience, what I found was that so many women came to see me that maybe didn't have a ground for divorce, but were being controlled by their husbands. And it was women who were unable to get out of very bad situations and very bad relationships.
Roseann,
Yes.
if I may,
Yes, Deborah.
it's not always, we always talk about the woman being intimidated, being coerced, the husband committing adultery. What about the side of the situation where it's exactly the opposite, where the man was being controlled by the woman, and where really he needed to get the divorce from her, although she may have. I mean, I've been through the courtroom, I know you've seen it all. So much of the divorce court, especially in New York State, leans towards the woman.
Really?
Is that true?
Is that
Oh,
true?
yes.
I mean,
I don't believe so. I really don't believe that to be
It's not
true.
equal. It's definitely not equal.
Well, you have to remember that fault doesn't affect finances
Correct.
in New York.
Correct.
So the laws have become very gender neutral. Custody laws have become gender neutral.
But a lot of it, I've been through every courtroom in this country, and I have found
And you're proud of that.
that in matrimonial court, it is very unlike other courtroom. There are not clear-cut rules on everything. A lot of it is within whoever the judge is. It's there's a real game being played out there, and it's not a fair game. If
But you're
he
saying
likes
that it's
you,
weighted
if
to
he
women.
likes you, he could make determinations based upon what he thinks is really going on.
But
If
I
he
always-
leans towards a certain part, I have seen it.
yeah,
It's not
but
that
I
way
always
in
thought it
criminal
was a
court.
formula-based, Roseann. I
The
always
only money,
understood-
only custody
Well, there are
issues.
so many issues that get
Right.
decided
Right,
in
right,
a divorce
right.
court. I mean,
Right.
it's custody visitation. But with respect to the formula that you're speaking of, both child support and temporary maintenance, and only temporary maintenance, is now formula-based. It hadn't been for a long time until the Child Support Standards Act came into effect. And now, with the new legislation in October of 2010, and I apologize for since that law came into effect, temporary maintenance guidelines and calculations are automatically done, and it's all based on income. How
Not
much,
assets, just income.
how much money does he make? How much money does she make?
So does this new no-fault law, or however we want to speak about it, how does it benefit women? Or does it benefit
It doesn't
women?
sound.
Well, it depends. It's too much of a generalization to say it benefits all women.
Right.
But it is going to allow women who were in situations that didn't rise to the level of both physical and mental abuse,
To get
who
out
didn't
easier.
have a husband who was committing adultery and we require direct proof of adultery.
Right.
It's going to allow women to get out of bad marriages where before they may not have been able to meet the burden of proof.
Oh, okay.
Now, in
That's wonderful.
addition,
Right.
if they are women who are earning, I would say on an average, this is an average, about less than 2/3 of what their husband is earning, then they will fall within that temporary maintenance calculation, and they will receive temporary maintenance. They will also receive, if they end up being the custodial parent in the situation, child support.
Okay.
Now, what's interesting about what happened with the law in October of 2010 is many people had, what I've seen is that the moneyed spouse, after these calculations are complete, turn out to be the non-moneyed spouse.
Oh, wow.
Because
That's an anti-divorce
there's a
percentage.
shift in income between the husband and the wife. And this happens mostly in situations where people are earning, you have a husband and a wife earning under $100,000. It can shift where one person who comes in as the moneyed spouse goes out as the non-moneyed spouse because he or she is paying to he or she
So
more
the
money.
standard of living for one party could deteriorate very quickly based on
Don't you
whatever
think
is
that's true in
negotiated.
general with divorce?
It
We're
is.
taking the super wealthy or the
Right.
very well off out of it, or people with independent wealth. You know, I think like when you're two people supporting one household,
Right.
and then you go to two people supporting two households plus
Right,
children.
it's just common
everything
sense.
changes.
Right.
But is that a difference between the new no-fault law, now the terms are being determined by the judge and the court versus mutual consent of?
No, nothing has changed in connection. Either party, on any divorce, you can reach a resolution. You don't need a judge.
Okay.
If you have two good attorneys, even a mediator who's very good, you can come up with an agreement, and no court, unless it's going to hurt the children, is going to undo it. The courts do make sure that there's language in every agreement that says that the children are being adequately supported.
Is it true that the person who is in control over the funds, not the paying parent, whether it's male or female, would have the control over the children because they're holding the bag of money?
Absolutely not.
So they can call the shots? Why is that?
Well, you're asking me, let me make sure I understand what you're
Okay.
asking me. You're asking me if the person who is in control of bank accounts and real estate
That means
assets.
there is the parent or the paying spouse to the custodial parent. So the custodial parent is in charge of all the funds for the children, for everything. They're getting that bag of money every single month in their account.
Yes.
They therefore have control over the kids, so to speak.
I think I understand what you're asking me, and there's a difference between doling out money for a child's activities or education or support and being the parent who makes the decision as to what school the child's going to go to. That rests in the custodial parent's hands. But the custodial parent, in today's day and age, it's very common that there are joint custody situations.
Right,
Yes.
that's a change.
But what if there isn't?
Well, then the person who has sole custody is going to make the decisions.
Right.
You know what I found interesting, Roseann, before the change, what really were the roadblocks that prevented this change? It took so long. You
The
kept
politics
hearing-
you're thinking
you
of,
kept-
or-
I'm thinking, yeah, the political aspect of the law, and why did it take, because you started hearing about changes back in 1998, 1999, it was brought up.
Great question. Great question. In addition to the politics, which I don't
Bureaucracy.
pretend to know, I can tell you that many women's groups were involved with the legislation, modifying the legislation. I met with many lawmakers myself. There was a lot of lobbying going on because what the women's groups wanted was to connect a financial obligation to the no-fault statute.
So that's the interim support. we're
Correct.
talking about.
Now,
Yes.
unfortunately, it's only interim in nature at the moment. It is going to be reviewed pursuant to the statute itself in December of 2011 to see whether it's working in New York State. There are many cases that are on appeal right now, and
And wasn't there a big expectation, again, Denise, to your point of like, oh, if we do this, all the sky's going to fall, that the courts would be so backlogged because there would be this flood of divorce
mass of people
applications
wanting
and
to get
has
divorced.
that transpired? Or?
no.
Interestingly
enough,
Right.
but if you look at the other states, pre-no fault and post-no fault, very similar. I don't think
It didn't take a
anybody,
crystal ball to figure out it wasn't going to be a
It
flood. It was
wasn't
just
gonna
a PR-able moment.
exactly.
So we're gonna hold that question. We will be right back. Welcome to Keeping It Brooklyn, where we highlight Brooklynites who are doing something really savvy. So you thought only a tree grows in Brooklyn. What about a farm? Well, that's what savvy Brooklynites Gina Argento and her brother Tony have done on the rooftop of one of their Brooklyn warehouses. The Argentos have always been environmental stewards. Broadway Stages has created Brooklyn's first organic rooftop farm where plump tomatoes, fresh green beans, and other produce is grown and sold to local restaurants and markets. They're supporting the environment and community. Now, how savvy is that? Okay, Brooklyn Savvy is back. Now, Denise, you had a question?
I do. One of the things that comes to mind is if you have an agreement, you have a divorce agreement, a settlement, is it carved in stone? Is this a fait accompli, or how many times can you go back and renegotiate?
Not many. However, there are certain aspects of the agreement that can be reviewed. The new law actually made a very substantial change concerning modification of child support on a every 3-year basis. Other than equitable distribution, the asset division is not something, once you agree to, that you can go back and change.
Makes sense.
Even if their status changes, even though their
No, if the status changes, no, definitely not.
Okay.
You'd have to
Right.
prove, to change an agreement,
Okay.
you'd have to prove that at the time of entering into the agreement, there was overreaching, there was duress, there was fraud, some sort of a mutual mistake. But the child support, because why? These children, they're not part of the contract, but they're a beneficiary of the contract. So the courts are always going to keep the children's best interests at heart. They're always going to look for that.
And before the change in the law, though, there were some escalations every few years, I thought, based
It would
on
depend.
income, but how does that get enforced?
Oh, well, if you have your judgments go through the support collection unit, if you choose to do that, then they would have given you a COLA, a cost of living increase. But other than that, what you need to, pre this new law, what you needed to prove was that there was an unanticipated change in circumstances, and the burden was so high.
I want to ask you something, Roseann. It's a difficult question for a lawyer because I'm actually targeting you.
Thank you.
The matrimonial courts are like, I mean, as in all courtrooms, and lawyers are there to make a living. How do you stop the procrastination of divorces and delaying tactics?
Great question.
That means the one who is gaining in order to, that means I keep it going for years and years and years. So I keep having that interim, as you mentioned, and then you get to the point where, now this is it. You got to start paying from here the real money. But you were paying until now, and you're broke by then.
Well, that's a very.
But as an attorney, you love it because it goes on and on.
Well, I don't love it because I'm busy enough where I don't need to dwell on
well, that may be you.
We got to let her answer that, right?
Well, there is something called standards and goals that are supposed to be met statewide on every particular case. And you have to aggressively represent a client, which means you have to make the judge know that there is procrastination going on here. You have to hire an advocate who's going to be able to effectively communicate that to the court. But I can tell you, since this is Brooklyn Savvy, that the Brooklyn courts, we have an incredible supervising judge here of the matrimonial parts who's very hands-on to all of the parts.
Who is that?
That's Judge Jeffrey Sunshine. And
Great last name.
Great name.
and he really does make sure that the cases move. But it's your attorneys, that's our role. Our role is to effectively communicate to the court that there's being an injustice done.
So let's move into this whole area of the Defense of Marriage Act. This was not something that I was really clued into. If you could just talk to us about what that is, and then what some of the ramifications of this are.
Okay, I refer to it as DOMA, Defense
yes.
of Marriage Act. President Clinton signed this law into effect in about 1996, and what it does say very clearly is that the federal government will not recognize marriage outside of any marriage being between a husband and a wife.
And defining that as gender.
Correct.
Right.
And even if a state allows same-sex marriage, federal government is not going to recognize it.
This is confusing, is it
That is
not?
confusing,
this crazy
yeah.
confusing?
Well, what's more
Right.
confusing is President Obama made a statement in the New York Times recently indicating that he's finding this law unconstitutional,
Right.
which will change.
The federal law.
Correct.
Right.
DOMA.
Roseann,
Right.
why aren't divorce laws under the federal domain? Why is it
I'm
under
not sure
the
I
states?
can, I'm
I
not
mean,
sure
maybe
I can
that's another
answer that.
show, but
Maybe.
It's like a lot of laws.
I mean,
Right,
could
sure.
it, could it be
Right.
changed, and especially if we do change the Marriage Act?
Oh my
or-
God, all of those
DOMA.
people in all those red states would never.
Never, of
know.
course, of course.
I see it as being a state law because we have our own needs. Every state has its own.
But a
needs.
marriage is
And
Yeah,
that
but a
is
marriage is
not-
marriage.
It seems to me
I
that
don't
if you're
agree.
married in one state, your marriage should be recognized in all
All
50.
states.
Just because it makes sense that way, but
Right.
it's not.
But
I
it's not
understand,
so
it's not.
simple.
Well,
Right.
It's not so
you
simple.
do realize
Except
that
this- right, the
same-sex
same-sex
marriages
piece, right.
that are, let's say, someone gets married in Connecticut and comes here to live, or Massachusetts, or any of the 8
Yes.
states that recognize same-sex marriage, once they come here, if they divorce here, they're recognized.
Right,
And you
right,
can get divorced
right.
here,
Right.
but you can't get married here.
Wow. Whoa. So
Well,
what's a
that's a
domestic
contradiction.
what's a domestic partnership then? Meaning, does it make more sense for people who want to be in same-sex relationships to have the domestic partnership? Is that viewed the same in all 50 states or no?
I wouldn't know how domestic partnership is viewed in other states. I will
Right,
tell you,
okay,
it's
right.
not equal to a marriage.
In what ways is it different?
Wow.
Well, first of all,
Yeah.
let's go back to DOMA for a minute.
Okay, all right.
What does it mean that the federal government doesn't recognize a
Tax
marriage?
return.
Well, not only
No.
that.
I mean, I'm just
I think
starting.
there's a lot
Start
of
with income taxation.
Right.
What about Social Security benefits?
Yeah,
That's
right.
What about
Inheritance.
immigration status?
Yes.
Right.
What about
Inheritance, yeah.
bankruptcy
Yeah.
protection?
Right.
All of it.
It's so unequal.
And
Right,
why? Well, that's a whole other show
Right,
to talk
right.
about,
Why?
Cuomo's new statement and
Right.
hopefully that the New York
So
State will
how does
move
this
forward.
domestic partnership though differ? I mean, what is it that it's not giving people? What doesn't
Not
it?
married. You don't
You're
get
not
married
married.
or
There's no
right.
protection.
Don't get
You
it
don't-
right
you
to
don't get
divorce.
that. Say-
No,
Right,
just as if
right.
you're not
So
getting the
what's- you
protection
can't
of it.
file.
Right?
Well,
What's
some
the point of
domestic
it?
partnerships allow health coverage.
Right, that's what then that's
But
it? That's all it
almost the
has?
extent of it,
Okay,
right?
pretty much.
But that's corporations, right? Or is that
It
not?
depends on the corporation.
But what I really wanted to ask is, what about, okay, let's use the example of a male and female living together and
Yeah,
have
the
lived together, the
cohabitation.
cohabitation aspect of it. How does that apply?
Well, they can also have a domestic partnership. They can also seek health benefits
Well,
as well.
it's seen the same
However,
way.
yes,
Is it-
it's
oh, it is
substantially
seen
the same way. But
Same.
they don't have any rights
Either.
either.
But why should that exist? Is this because we're being lax? Should feminist groups or whatever it takes?
On a personal level,
Because children are born within the confines of these kinds of relationships.
and
they're
that brings
just-
other legal issues up
Right,
because
right.
there's a presumption of legitimacy of a child, of a marriage. There isn't. If
Isn't
there
that
is
word
none-
gone
thought that was
now?
gone.
Legitimacy, vital wedlock, I guess it still carries
No,
a lot
it
of weight
still-
in law.
it
It still
carries.
exists?
Oh.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Oh.
Presumption.
I did not know
There's a
that.
presumption that the person in the marriage is the mother or the father of the child.
Right.
But if
Oh,
not,
I see.
if you're not
I
married.
You know what, girls?
What about
We
maternity
need-
tests? That
we
takes
need
care of that.
female president. That's
Well,
why.
that's right.
I'll fix a lot of stuff.
You know, and I think it'd be really interesting though to ask Roseann, I'm gonna put you on the spot here. We were talking before about you represent men and women, I'm assuming?
I do.
And I imagine there are nut jobs on both sides of the gender divide, but
There are.
but what kind of client? Who's your dream? I mean, you work in a difficult field in terms of emotionally. It's at a difficult time in a couple's life. But what's a good divorce?
Well, let
Is
me
there
ask
such
you
a
what
thing?
my,
Is there such a
my
thing?
dream
Yes,
client.
is there?
My dream client is a client who puts their children's needs before their own.
Perfect. Well, that's a
Perfect.
dream parent.
Right.
That's a fantasy.
No, it's not.
No,
No, it's not.
I disagree.
No, but
I
what else?
I would.
Roseann,
I would do that.
A dream client is the client who recognizes that fault is not going to affect finances, and therefore deals with the emotional issues with a therapist or someone who's been educated in that field, and let me do what I have to do.
You're on the business end of it.
Well, I'm on the business end of it. You certainly need to hold certain people's hands. It's the second most stressful aspect after death in life situations. And so I certainly have to be cognizant of that, but I have to do my job. And it's difficult to have to rationalize someone's emotions and do my job at the same time.
I've been itching to ask you this question.
Yeah, then I got one. I got one.
How do you go from being in love with somebody
that's
to want to murder them?
Oh no, you know what? I think that's. I don't know if that needs a question. It's not a question.
Well,
No, you answer that question. You answer that question. I'm trying to back on you. You answer that question. I'm protecting the guest. How do you do that?
I've never really.
I think we can all talk about relationships that have gone south, right?
Right.
Okay, that's essentially what that is.
I
No,
think
I said gone south.
No, but I mean, in divorce court, it's a little different. You get to a point where people are on two sides, but you have to almost you have to have.
You're talking about like a War of Roses type of scenario.
You know what it is?
That's probably a rarity.
Everybody internalizes anger and hurt and pain differently.
Yes.
And I think that people need to be a grown-up. You have to be grown-up to be married. And you have to...
In every state.
Good point.
I mean, I don't think so. I think there are states where you can be 16 and get married.
Well, I think that this is a great place to end. Thank you so much, Roseann. You have been just brilliant. The Savvy panel thanks you. That's all the time we have for this episode of Brooklyn Savvy. See you next time.